I was kneeling on the freezing hardwood floor, clutching my grandfather's skeletal, trembling hand, trying desperately to transfer what little warmth I had left into him. By rights, at this hour, the house should have been overflowing with the smell of roasted turkey. But no. The furnace had been killed dead in the middle of a sub-zero winter. On the table, a single note from my parents lay bare. Mom and Dad are on the cruise. Don't turn on the heat, it's too expensive. My tears, which I thought had dried up on the battlefield, rolled hot down my cheeks and then instantly turned cold. My chest tightened, not from the bone-chilling cold, but from the cruelty of the very people who gave birth to me. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. Grandpa whispered the name of an old comrade in his delirium, not recognizing the granddaughter desperately trying to keep him warm. They had left their own father to rot in the dark in exchange for a luxury vacation. I, Sergeant Eliza Martin, clenched my fists until my fingernails dug into my flesh. Could I snatch his life back from the Reaper in time? And would I be ruthless enough to make my parents pay for this crime? The cold in Chicago tonight wasn't like the cold in the mountains of Afghanistan. That was physical, a test of endurance. This was the temperature of betrayal. I ripped the thin, moth-eaten blanket off him, the only thing they had left to cover a decorated war hero. The sight made my stomach turn. His skin was cyanotic, a terrifying shade of blue-gray that looked like bruised marble. I pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, my own hand shaking. The pulse was thready, weak, fluttering like a bird trapped in a box. "Grandpa! Grandpa! It's Eliza! I'm home!" I shouted, my command voice cracking into something desperate. He didn't respond. Just a low, meaningless moan escaped his blue lips. I knew the signs. I had seen them on the faces of young privates left too long in the snow. Stage 3. Hypothermia. He wasn't shivering anymore. That was the worst sign. In the Corps, we learned that when the shivering stops, the body has surrendered. I didn't have time to break down. Tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. I stripped off my tactical winter jacket, USMC issue, designed to keep a Marine alive in the worst conditions on Earth, and wrapped it around his frail body. It swallowed him whole. "Stay with me, Marine. That's an order," I whispered, my voice fierce. I sprinted to the bathroom cabinet, my boots thudding heavily on the expensive floor. I tore it open, searching frantically. Empty. No heart medication, no blood thinners. Just rows and rows of Linda's anti-aging vitamins and expensive diet supplements. I ran to the kitchen to boil water, hoping to create improvised heat packs. My hands shook, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of pure, unadulterated fury. On the stainless steel refrigerator, held up by cute little magnets, were photos of Robert and Linda. They were tanned, holding margaritas, smiling with blinding white teeth on the deck of a cruise ship in Cabo. They looked like the perfect American couple. And 10 feet away, in the living room they inherited, the man who built their fortune was freezing to death. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The verse from Psalm 46:1 played in my head, a rhythm to match my chest compressions as I checked him again. I grabbed my phone and dialed my father. The line rang. Once, twice. Then the voicemail picked up. "Hi, you've reached Robert and Linda. We are currently enjoying a tropical paradise. Leave a message, but we probably won't listen." My father's voice was so cheerful, so fake, it felt like a physical slap across the face. I roared into the receiver, a sound that came from the gut. "Dad, Grandpa is dying. You turned off the heat? Where the hell are you?" Silence. Just the beep of the recording ending. They didn't care. They genuinely, truly did not care. General Mattis once said, "No better friend, no worse enemy than a U.S. Marine." My parents had forgotten that. They thought they were dealing with their obedient daughter. They were about to meet their worst enemy. 5 minutes later, the wail of sirens shattered the polite silence of our wealthy Lake Forest neighborhood. Blue and red lights flashed against the snow-covered lawns where neighbors were peeking through their curtains. I didn't give a damn about their gossip. 2 EMTs rushed in with a stretcher. They were pros, moving fast. But as they lifted Grandpa, one of them, a guy in his 40s with a compassionate face, looked at the thermostat, then at Grandpa's emaciated frame, and finally at me. His eyes narrowed. "Are you family, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, my voice steel. "I'm his granddaughter." "How does this happen?" he asked, his tone laced with disgust. "How do you let a human being get to this state in a house like this?" The question hit me harder than shrapnel. He thought I did this. He thought I was the one who starved him, who froze him. I wanted to scream that I had just landed from Camp Pendleton, that I was the savior, not the villain. But the words stuck in my throat. This was the shame my grandfather had been living in. This was the dignity they had stolen from him. I climbed into the back of the ambulance, ignoring the EMT's judgmental stare. I took Grandpa's ice-cold hand in mine again. As the vehicle lurched forward, speeding toward the hospital, I looked back at the dark, looming silhouette of the house. I wasn't panicking anymore. The Marine Corps training had taken over completely now. The mission was clear. "Hold on, Grandpa," I whispered into the chaotic noise of the siren, feeling the vibration of the road beneath us. "Just hold on. I'm taking command now." The emergency room at Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital was a blinding white purgatory. It smelled of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and low-grade panic. I stood pressed against the wall in the corner of Triage Bay 4, my desert camo uniform stained with travel dust and grease, looking like a chaotic blemish in this pristine, sterilized world. A middle-aged nurse with a tight bun and a name tag that read, "Sarah." Head nurse marched toward me. She didn't look at my rank insignia. She didn't look at the worry etched into my face. She looked at me like I was something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. "We need his insurance information," she said, her voice flat and clipped. "Medicare card, supplemental. And you need to know that hospital administration has already flagged this case. The police have been notified." I blinked, the exhaustion momentarily stunning me. "Police? Why? I just brought him in." Sarah crossed her arms, the clipboard hugging her chest like a shield. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my tactical boots with undisguised contempt. "Miss Martin, in the state of Illinois, elder neglect is a Class 2 felony. That man in there didn't just get cold. He has been systematically starved and frozen. How long did you leave him in that condition? A week? 2? "I just got back," I stammered, my voice cracking. "I've been deployed. I came home 2 hours ago. My parents, they went on a cruise." "A likely story," she muttered, turning on her heel. "Tell it to the social worker." Before I could grab her arm and make her listen, the curtain whipped back. A doctor stepped out. Dr. Evans. He was tall, graying, with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much human ugliness. He held a tablet, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges. "Ms. Martin," he said, cutting through the noise of the ER. "We need to talk. Now." He led me to a small consultation area, ignoring my protests. "The hypothermia is being treated," he started, his voice clinical but sharp as a scalpel. "But that is the least of his problems. Your grandfather is suffering from stage 3 malnutrition. He weighs 115 pounds. A man of his height should be 170. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Malnutrition?" "Starvation," Dr. Evans corrected, brutal and direct. "And then there are the decubitus ulcers, bed sores, on his lower back and hips. Judging by the necrosis, he has been lying in his own waste on a singular pressure point for at least 3 weeks. His skin has literally rotted away." I put a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob, but the doctor wasn't done. "We see this every year around the holidays," Dr. Evans said, his voice dripping with icy judgment. "We call it granny dumping. Families want to go on their Aspen ski trips or their Caribbean cruises, and grandma or grandpa becomes an inconvenience. So they stop feeding them, stop giving them meds, or just drop them off at the ER claiming sudden illness so the state has to babysit them while they drink martinis. It is torture, Ms. Martin. Slow, domestic torture." Every word was a hammer blow to my chest. They hadn't just left him. They had been killing him, slowly, painfully, for weeks. Suddenly, the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor in Bay 4 accelerated. Beep, beep, beep. He's waking up, the doctor said. I rushed past him, tearing through the curtain. Grandpa Harold was awake. His eyes were open, milky and unfocused, darting around the room in terror. When he saw me, he flinched. He actually flinched, as if he expected me to hit him. Grandpa, it's me. It's Eliza, I whispered, grabbing his hand. It was warmer now thanks to the heated blankets, but still fragile as glass. He blinked, his eyes focusing on my face. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by a look of sheer, heartbreaking shame. Eliza. His voice was a dry, cracking whisper. He tried to pull his hand away, but I held tight. Don't let them take me to the home. No one is taking you anywhere, Grandpa, I promised, tears blurring my vision. You're safe. He shook his head weakly, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye into his silver hairline. Your father. Robert said. He said nursing homes cost too much money. He said the inheritance. The house. He coughed, his entire body convulsing, before he gasped out the sentence that shattered my soul. He told me, if I just lay still, the hunger goes away eventually. Stop for a second, I need you to really hear that. A son told his 80-year-old father to starve to death to save money. If you are feeling the same rage I'm feeling right now, I need you to hit that like button and comment, Justice for Harold, below. Let me know that I am not the only one who thinks this is unforgivable. I stood there, frozen. The hospital sounds faded into a dull roar. That was it. It wasn't just negligence. It wasn't just selfishness. It was a calculation. Robert and Linda didn't just want a vacation. They wanted him dead. They wanted to speed up the process to protect their bank accounts, to ensure the nursing home fees didn't eat into the estate they felt entitled to. My sadness evaporated. In its place, something else ignited. It was a cold, hard heat, the kind I felt before kicking down a door in a combat zone. The nurse, Sarah, was watching me from the station, phone in hand, probably calling Adult Protective Services to report me. Let her call. Let the police come. Let the whole damn world come. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my hand. I leaned down and kissed Grandpa's forehead. Grandpa, I whispered, my voice steady and low, vibrating with a dangerous promise. I swear to you on the Marine Corps emblem, they will never hurt you again. They declared war on the wrong soldier. I straightened my uniform, pulled my shoulders back, and looked at the reflection in the glass door. The crying granddaughter was gone. Sergeant Martin was on duty. And I was going to burn their world to the ground. I returned to the house at 3:00 a.m. The streetlights of Lake Forest cast long, distorted shadows across the snow-covered lawn, making the Georgian-style mansion look less like a home and more like a mausoleum. I unlocked the front door, the click of the deadbolt echoing loudly in the silence. The house was warm now. I had turned the heat back on before leaving for the hospital, but it felt colder than ever. Every piece of expensive furniture, every crystal vase, every perfectly vacuumed rug seemed to mock me. They were trophies bought with stolen dignity. I walked into the kitchen, the heart of the home. The stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerator hummed softly in the dark. I pulled open the heavy double doors. The light washed over me, revealing a culinary paradise. The top shelves, my parents' territory, were stocked like a five-star restaurant. There were bottles of Veuve Clicquot champagne chilling on their sides. There were blocks of imported French Brie and Gruyere. In the meat drawer, vacuum-sealed packages of Wagyu beefsteaks sat ready for the grill. Then, I looked down. Hidden in the back of the bottom shelf, behind a wall of craft beer bottles, was Grandpa's ration. It was a graveyard of nutrition. Dented cans of generic, high-sodium vegetable soup that you find in the discount bin at the dollar store. A loaf of Wonder Bread that had turned green with mold weeks ago. A half-empty jar of grape jelly that had crystallized. That was it. That was what they fed a man who had earned a Purple Heart defending this country. My hands were trembling as I closed the fridge. I needed to see his room. I needed to see the cell they had kept him in. I walked up the stairs, my tactical boots silent on the plush carpet. I pushed open the door to the guest room. The smallest room in the house, the one facing the north wind. The smell hit me instantly. In my panic earlier, the adrenaline had masked it. But now, in the stillness, the stench of ammonia was overpowering. It was the smell of old urine soaked into fabric. I flipped on the light switch. The mattress was stained yellow and brown. There were no boxes of Depends, no adult care products, nothing to help an 80-year-old man maintain his hygiene. They hadn't just starved him, they had forced him to live like an animal in his own filth. I moved to the nightstand to pack a bag for him, trying to breathe through my mouth. That's when I saw it. Sitting next to a dusty lamp was a small, open tin can. A plastic spoon, crusted with dried brown residue, sat inside it. I picked up the can, confused. The label was peeled back, but the logo was unmistakable. Friskies, pâté, ocean whitefish, cat food. We didn't own a cat. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the gut. They weren't just feeding him cheap soup. When the soup ran out, or maybe just because they were too lazy to cook, they had fed my grandfather pet food. My stomach lurched violently. I dropped the can, clapped a hand over my mouth, and sprinted to the attached bathroom. I fell to my knees in front of the toilet and retched until there was nothing left in my stomach but bile and rage. I sat there on the cold tile floor, wiping my mouth, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't neglect. This was dehumanization. They had stripped him of his humanity piece by piece. I stood up, washed my face, and looked in the mirror. The sadness in my eyes was gone. It was replaced by the cold, calculating look of a predator. I walked out of Grandpa's room and straight into the master suite. It smelled of lavender and expensive potpourri. My mother's vanity table was cluttered with jars of La Mer cream and Chanel perfumes. Hundreds of dollars of product just sitting there collecting dust. Next to the mirror lay her household ledger. Linda was obsessive about tracking expenses, a habit she claimed was good management. I opened the black leather notebook to the entries for November and December. Her handwriting was neat, precise, and sociopathic. November 15th, manicure, pedicure, $150. November the 20th, Goldie's spa day, grooming and massage, $200. December 1st, Christmas party deposit, $3,000. And then, at the bottom of the page, written in red ink, RX, Dad's arthritis medication, Celebrex, $45. She had drawn a thick line through it. Next to it, she had scrawled a note. Too expensive. Budget cut? Use aspirin. She spent $200 to massage a poodle. She spent $3,000 to impress neighbors she secretly hated. But $45 to stop her father-in-law's bones from grinding together in agony? That was too expensive. I slammed the book shut, my breathing ragged. They had monetized his suffering. Every dollar they saved on his pain was a dollar they spent on their vanity. I needed air. But before I left this house of horrors, I remembered something. Years ago, before I deployed for the first time, Grandpa had pulled me aside. He looked frail even then. He had whispered, "Eliza, if things ever go bad, if I can't speak for myself, look in your grandmother's Bible." I went downstairs to the small library. It was dusty. My parents never read. On the bottom shelf, tucked away like a forgotten memory, was Grandma's old leather-bound King James Bible. I pulled it out. The leather was cracked. The gold lettering faded. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were thin as onion skin. I flipped past Genesis, past the Psalms. There, wedged tightly into the table of contents, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out. It was heavy. Inside, there was no cash. Instead, I pulled out a stack of legal documents and a small silver USB drive. On the front of the envelope, in handwriting that was shaky but determined, Grandpa had written a message. For Eliza. When you are ready to fight. I gripped the USB drive in my hand. It felt cold, metallic, and heavy with potential. This wasn't just a diary. This was ammunition. Grandpa hadn't been senile. He hadn't been unaware. He had been watching. He had been recording. I pocketed the drive and the documents. I took one last look around the dark, silent house. It didn't scare me anymore. It was just a building occupied by criminals, and I had just found the weapon that would evict them. I checked my watch. 4:15 a.m. I wouldn't sleep tonight. I had a meeting to schedule. David Monroe, Grandpa's old lawyer, was going to get a very early wake-up call. The investigation was over. The prosecution was about to begin. At 8 a.m. sharp, I walked into the law offices of Monroe and Associates. The building was an old brick structure in downtown Lake Forest, smelling of lemon polish and old paper. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, terrifying white of the hospital. David Monroe, Grandpa's attorney and oldest friend, looked like he had aged 10 years since I last saw him. He was a man of the old school, three-piece suits, tortoiseshell glasses, and a belief in a handshake as a binding contract. But today, his hands were trembling as he plugged the silver USB drive I'd found in the Bible into his laptop. We sat in silence as the first audio file played. The voice that filled the oak-paneled room was unmistakable. It was my mother, Linda. But it wasn't the sweet, social climber voice she used at parties. It was a jagged, venomous hiss. "Sign the check, old man. If you don't sign it, don't bother coming down for dinner tonight." The kitchen is closed. Then a pause, a shuffling sound, and then Grandpa's voice, weak, broken. "Linda, please. That's my pension. I need to refill my prescription. You don't need pills. You need to stop being a burden. Sign it." David Monroe slammed the laptop shut, his face draining of color. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, taking a long, shaky breath. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he whispered. He recorded everything, every threat, every extortion. "Eliza, this isn't just family drama. This is coercive control. This is a hostage situation." He stood up and walked over to a heavy filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a thick, dusty folder labeled Harold Martin, Estate. "For years, your parents have been strutting around town, telling anyone who would listen that they were graciously letting your grandfather live in their house," David said, his voice hardening. "They claimed the deed was transferred to them years ago for tax purposes." He slammed a document onto the desk. It was yellowed with age, but the seal was clear. "They lied," he said. "This is the original deed. The house is 100% in the name of Harold Martin. He never signed the quitclaim deed. He refused. Legally, Robert and Linda are nothing more than guests. Guests who have overstayed their welcome by 2 decades. I looked at the document. The house, the mansion worth millions, belonged to the man they were starving in the guest room. "And there's more," David continued, opening a fresh file he had compiled since I called him at dawn. "I pulled the bank records this morning. It's a bloodbath, Eliza. We spent the next hour reviewing the forensic accounting of a crime scene. It was sickening. My grandfather's Social Security, his Marine Corps pension, his investment dividends. All of it had been funneled into a joint account my father had access to as a caretaker. But the money didn't go to care. We traced the transactions. $2,000 at a riverboat casino in Joliet. $5,000 at the Louis Vuitton store on the Magnificent Mile. First-class tickets to Aruba. Wine club memberships. In the last 5 years, they had drained over $200,000. This is Class 1 financial exploitation of an elderly person, David said, tapping the spreadsheet with a pen. Under the Elder Justice Act, combined with the physical neglect, we have enough here to put them away for 10 to 15 years. They breached their fiduciary duty. They embezzled. And judging by some of these checks, they forged his signature. My parents weren't just bad people, they were felons." David looked at me, his eyes fierce. "What do you want to do, Eliza? We can have the police pick them up at O'Hare the second they land." I thought about it. I thought about the cold room, the cat food, the years of silence Grandpa endured just to keep the peace, just to have a family. Arresting them at the airport was too easy. They would play the victim. They would claim it was a misunderstanding. "No," I said, my voice calm. "I want them to come home. I want them to walk through that door thinking they are the kings of the castle. I want to see the look on their faces when the kingdom crumbles." I picked up my phone. Cancel the cards, David. Freeze the joint account. Cut off the oxygen. David nodded and made the call. 10 minutes later, the credit line, the lifeline that fueled my parents' delusion of wealth, was severed. It didn't take long. My phone started vibrating against the mahogany desk like an angry hornet. The caller ID flashed. Dad! I picked up. I didn't say a word. Eliza! My father screamed. The background noise was loud, clinking silverware, chatter. He was at a restaurant. What the hell did you do? I'm at the bistro. My card just got declined. He didn't ask about Grandpa. He didn't ask if the heat was on. He was worried about his image. Do you know how embarrassing this is? He shouted, his voice slurring slightly. He was already drunk. The waiter is looking at me like I'm a bum. You fix this right now, you ungrateful brat. Call the bank and tell them it's a mistake. I listened to his breathing, heavy and panicked. If that card isn't working in 5 minutes, he hissed, dropping his voice to a menacing growl. I swear to God, when I get home, I am kicking that old man out onto the street. I'm done with charity. Do you hear me? I heard him, loud and clear. He was threatening to evict the owner of the house. He was threatening the man whose money was paying for the steak he had just eaten. I looked at David. I looked at the file of evidence that was about to destroy Robert Martin's life. Have a safe flight home, Dad, I said softly. I hung up. My father thought he was holding all the cards. He didn't realize he was sitting at a table that had already been flipped over. He was coming home to a war zone, and he was walking straight into the kill box. Dr. Evans was furious. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room, blocking my path with his clipboard held high like a shield. You cannot take him, Eliza. This is against medical advice. He's stable, yes, but he is weak. His electrolyte levels are barely balanced. If he goes back to that environment, he could crash within hours. I looked at the doctor, then at Grandpa Harold, who was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. He was pale, shaking slightly, but his jaw was set in a line of granite determination I hadn't seen in years. He needs to go home, doctor, I said, signing the discharge papers with a sharp scratch of the pen. Not to die, but to take back what is his. I have a medic bag in the car. I'll monitor his vitals every 15 minutes, but we are leaving. The drive back to Lake Forest was silent. The snow had started to fall again. Big, heavy flakes that signaled a lake-effect blizzard was coming off Lake Michigan. When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't take Grandpa to the guest room. That freezing cell was a crime scene, not a bedroom. Instead, I helped him walk, slowly, painfully, into the center of the living room. There stood the high-backed leather wingback chair. It was the throne of the house. For 20 years, my father, Robert, had claimed it as his own. He would sit there with his scotch, pontificating about business deals that never happened, while Grandpa was relegated to a folding chair in the corner. Sit here, Grandpa, I said gently. He hesitated. Robert doesn't like anyone sitting in his chair. It's not his chair, I said, lowering him onto the leather. It's yours. Everything here is yours. Then came the armor. I had retrieved his uniform from the back of the cedar closet where my mother had hidden it. The United States Marine Corps dress blues. They were immaculate. The dark blue high collar, the blood stripe running down the trousers, the gold buttons. I helped him dress. It was a heartbreaking process. The uniform, which had once fitted him like a second skin, now hung loosely on his frame. The collar gaped around his neck, highlighting the tendons that stood out from starvation. I had to tighten the belt 3 notches past its original hole. But when I pinned the Purple Heart onto his chest, right above the ribbons from Korea, something changed. He straightened his spine. The tremor in his hands seemed to steady. He wasn't a victim of elder abuse anymore. He was Corporal Harold Martin. Now we set the stage. I cleared the coffee table. No legal files, no bank statements, no evidence of the investigation. I wanted the room to look normal. I wanted them to walk in thinking they were still in control, thinking I was just the obedient daughter who had come home early to fix the furnace. I went to the kitchen and turned on the oven. I pulled out ground beef, onions, breadcrumbs, and ketchup. I began to make a meatloaf. It was a strategic choice. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes was my father's favorite meal. It was the smell of comfort, of a warm Midwestern winter night. As the savory scent of baking meat and caramelized ketchup began to fill the house, masking the lingering cold, I knew it would act as a tranquilizer. It would lower their guard. It would make them salivate. I dimmed the lights. I turned off the overhead chandelier and left only the floor lamps and the fireplace burning. The fire crackled softly, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. It was 6 p.m. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. The blizzard had arrived. Grandpa sat in the wing-back chair, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of conflict. He loved his son. Even after everything, the biological instinct to protect his child was fighting against the reality of the monster that child had become. "You think you can do this, Grandpa?" I asked from the shadows of the dining room entrance, where I stood guard. He took a shaky breath. "It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do, Eliza. Harder than Inchon." "You're not alone," I reminded him. "I'm your fire team. I've got your 6. He nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. Then, we saw it. Through the large bay window, headlights swept across the snow-covered front lawn, cutting through the darkness like searchlights. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. The engine cut, and the lights died. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the anticipation of the strike. I heard car doors slam, then the sound of heavy luggage wheels crunching over the salted pavement. Voices drifted through the front door, loud and obnoxious, shattering the sacred silence we had built. "Jesus, it is freezing!" My mother's voice pierced the air, shrill and complaining. "I told you we should have stayed an extra day. My toes are numb." "Relax, Linda, relax," my father's voice boomed. He sounded sloppy. The slur in his words told me he had been drinking since they left the airport. The front door unlocked. The handle turned. The door swung open, letting in a gust of Arctic wind and a swirl of snow. Robert and Linda Martin stumbled into the foyer, dragging their Louis Vuitton suitcases. They were dressed in light travel clothes, ridiculous for a Chicago winter, shivering and stomping their feet. My father was holding a plastic traveler cup, likely filled with airport margarita. His face was flushed red, partly from the cold, mostly from the alcohol and the rage that had been brewing since I canceled his credit card. "What is that smell?" Linda asked, sniffing the air. "Is that meatloaf?" She smiled, a greedy reflex reaction. They thought I had cooked for them. They thought I was apologizing. Then Robert looked up. He didn't look at the kitchen. He looked at the living room. "Eliza!" he roared, kicking the door shut behind him. "Where the hell are you? You get out here and explain why my Visa card was declined in front of the damn Johnsons. Do you have any idea how humiliated I was?" They marched into the living room, dropping their bags on the floor with a heavy thud. They were focused on their anger, on their entitlement. They didn't see the trap until the steel jaws were already snapping shut. They stopped dead in their tracks. There, in the center of the room, illuminated by the flickering firelight, sat the man they thought was dying in the back bedroom. He wasn't lying in filth. He wasn't wearing rags. He was sitting in the master's chair, wearing the full-dress uniform of a United States Marine, staring at them with eyes that had seen war. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. My father reached over and slapped the dimmer switch, flooding the room with harsh, blinding light. The warm, intimate atmosphere of the fireplace was instantly shattered. He stood there, swaying slightly, staring at the man sitting in the wingback chair. For a second, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, the instinctive fear a child has when caught by a parent. But Robert Martin was too arrogant and too drunk to let that last. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "What the hell is this?" he sneered, gesturing at Grandpa with his half-empty traveler cup. "Is this a joke? Are you playing toy soldier, old man? You look like a scarecrow in a Halloween costume." My mother, Linda, crossed her arms, shivering in her thin resort wear. "Seriously, Eliza, You dragged him out here to guilt trip us? After we pay the mortgage? After we put food on the table for 20 years? We have been carrying this dead weight for decades. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dead weight? I repeated, my voice low. I stepped between them and Grandpa. I reached into my cargo pocket and pulled out the thick stack of bank statements David Monroe and I had compiled. I didn't hand them over. I threw them onto the coffee table. They fanned out like a deck of cards, revealing column after column of highlighted transactions. $200,000, I said, looking my father dead in the eye. That's how much of his dead weight you've spent in the last 5 years. His VA disability checks, his Social Security, his life savings. You didn't carry him. He carried you. Robert's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged. He looked at the papers, then at me. You little bitch, he spat. You broke into my office? You went through my private records. He lunged at me. It was a clumsy, alcohol-fueled swing aimed at my face. He had never hit me before, but desperation makes people do ugly things. He forgot who I was. He forgot where I had been. I didn't flinch. I sidestepped his fist with the ease of a drill instructor watching a clumsy recruit. As his arm passed me, I grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back in a standard Marine Corps compliance lock. I applied just enough pressure to the joint to immobilize him without breaking the bone. Dad, stop, I shouted, forcing him down to his knees. He groaned in pain, pinned against the coffee table, his face pressed near the evidence of his crimes. This isn't your property, Dad, I hissed into his ear. It's evidence. Let him go, Linda screamed, rushing forward, her nails clawing at the air. You're assaulting your father. I'm calling the police. I'm going to have you arrested and thrown out of my house. My house. She still didn't get it. I released my father. He scrambled back, rubbing his wrist, looking at me with a mixture of shock and hatred. Get out, he panted. Both of you. Get out of my house right now. I don't care if he freezes to death. Get out. I didn't move. I simply pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and turned the volume all the way up. Play. The recording from the USB drive cut through the room. It was crisp and clear. Why won't he just die already? It was Linda's voice. If he dies before the new year, we can sell the house before the market dips. I'm sick of waiting, Robert. Just stop giving him the heart pills. Nature will take its course. The silence that followed was absolute. Linda's face went from flushed to ghostly pale in a heartbeat. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Robert, then at me, and finally, terrified, at the man in the chair. Grandpa Harold stood up. He didn't use the armrests. He didn't use a cane. He rose slowly, fighting gravity and malnutrition with sheer force of will. He stood straight, his spine aligning with the discipline ingrained in him 60 years ago. The dress blues hung loose on his frame, but at that moment, he looked 10 feet tall. He walked past me. He stopped directly in front of his son. Robert looked up from the floor, cowering. For the first time in his life, he looked small. Dad, Robert stammered. It was just talk. We were stressed. Robert, Grandpa's voice rumbled. It was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the tremor that had plagued him for years. I fought in the Chosin Reservoir. I watched good men die in the frozen mud to protect the values of this country. I fought against tyranny. I fought against cruelty. He looked down at his son with profound, devastating disappointment. I never imagined that the final enemy I would have to face would be the boy I raised. He reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out the original deed to the house. He dropped it onto the coffee table, right on top of the stolen bank statements. This house is mine, Grandpa said. It has always been mine. I never signed it over. I let you stay because I loved you. But love without respect is just a hostage situation. He checked his watch, an old, battered field watch he had worn since Korea. You have 30 minutes, he declared. Robert blinked. What? You have 30 minutes to pack your bags and leave my property, Grandpa said, his voice hard as iron. If you are still here at 7:45, I will call Sheriff Miller. You remember Jim Miller? He was my mortar man in '52. He's the sheriff now. and nothing would make him happier than to drag you out of here in handcuffs for elder abuse and trespassing. But where will we go? Linda whispered, her voice trembling. It's a blizzard out there. Grandpa looked at the window, where the snow was swirling violently against the glass. You have credit cards, don't you? Oh, wait. Eliza canceled those. He turned his back on them and sat down in his chair. Start packing. If you think Grandpa Harold was right to kick them out into the blizzard after what they did, I need you to smash that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, if you were in his shoes, would you have given them 30 minutes or would you have called the cops immediately? Type Team Harold if you stand with the old soldier. Robert and Linda stood there for a second, paralyzed by the sudden, violent shift in power. They looked at me, hoping for mercy. I just pointed at the clock. 29 minutes, I said. The trial was over, the verdict was guilty. And the sentence was immediate eviction. My father, Robert, tried to laugh. It was a hollow, desperate sound that bounced off the high ceilings of the living room, sounding more like a cough than a chuckle. He looked around the room as if searching for a hidden camera, unable to process that his reign of terror had ended so abruptly. Come on, Dad, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his panicked eyes. You've made your point. Very dramatic. The uniform, the speech, bravo. But let's be realistic. You're not actually kicking your own son out on the street in the middle of a blizzard. It's Christmas Eve, for God's sake. What will the neighbors think if they see us dragging suitcases through the snow? Grandpa Harold didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply looked at his old field watch again. You have 28 minutes, Robert, he said, his tone as cold as the wind howling outside. And don't worry about the neighbors. They stopped respecting you years ago. They know exactly what kind of man lets his father wither away while he buys a new Porsche. The silence of this house was the only thing protecting your reputation, and that silence is over. The reality finally hit Robert. The color drained from his flushed face, leaving him looking gray and old. Linda, he screamed, panic taking over. Pack the bags. He's crazy. He's actually doing it. My mother moved like a tornado. She scrambled up the stairs, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. I followed her, not to help, but to supervise. I watched as she tore through the master bedroom, the room that should have been Grandpa's, and started sweeping jewelry and clothes into her open suitcase. She grabbed a handful of silk scarves. Then she reached for the top shelf of the closet. Her hands, trembling with rage and greed, clutched the handles of a black crocodile skin Hermes Birkin bag. It was a purse worth more than most cars. I stepped into the doorway, blocking her exit. Leave the bag, Mom, I said calmly. She froze, clutching the purse to her chest like a shield. Excuse me, this is mine. I shook my head slowly. I saw the receipt, Mom. Neiman Marcus, last July, $12,000, paid for with the joint account. That bag was bought with Grandpa's pension money. She glared at me, her eyes filled with a level of hatred I had never seen before. It's a gift. I deserve this. I put up with his coughing and his shuffling around for years. It's not a gift, I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave. It's evidence of grand larceny. Or it's Grandpa's property. Either way, it stays here. If you walk out that door with it, I add theft to the police report I'm filing in the morning. Your choice. For a second, I thought she was going to attack me. Her knuckles turned white, but then she looked at my face, the face of a Marine who had cleared rooms in Fallujah. And she realized she had no leverage left. She screamed, a guttural sound of pure frustration, and threw the bag onto the floor. It landed with a heavy thud. You are a monster, Eliza, she hissed, grabbing a fistful of cheap costume jewelry instead. I hope you rot in this house with that old corpse. I didn't flinch. I just pointed to the door. Tick-tock, Mom. Downstairs, the situation was even more pathetic. Robert was pacing in the foyer, his phone pressed to his ear. He was making the rounds, calling the friends he had bought drinks for at the country club for the last decade. Hey, Mike, it's Bob. Yeah, listen, funny story. The furnace went out at the place, and it's freezing. Could Linda and I crash in your guest wing for a couple of days? Hello? Mike? He pulled the phone away, staring at the screen in disbelief. He dialed again. Tom? Hey, buddy. Listen, I need a huge favor. What do you mean you have company? Tom, I bought you that set of Callaway clubs for your birthday. Tom. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching him realize the brutal truth of his life. He had no friends. He had an audience. And now that the show was over and the money was gone, the audience had left the theater. He was completely, utterly alone. 20 minutes, I called out. The next quarter hour was a blur of chaotic motion. They stuffed their expensive resort wear into bags, completely unprepared for the Chicago winter waiting outside. Linda put on a fur coat that she hadn't worn in years, smelling of mothballs. Robert found a cashmere scarf, wrapping it around his neck with shaking hands. When the grandfather clock in the hall chimed the half hour, they were standing at the front door. 2 large suitcases, 2 people who had lost everything because they wanted too much. Grandpa Harold stood by the window, his back to them. He refused to look. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of heartbreak. He couldn't bear to watch his son leave like this, but he knew he couldn't let him stay. Robert put his hand on the doorknob. He paused, looking back at the warm, glowing living room. At the life of ease he had taken for granted. He looked at me, his eyes wet with tears of self-pity. Dad. Eliza. I'm sorry, he mumbled. It wasn't an apology for the starvation. It wasn't an apology for the theft. It was an apology because he was scared. Go, I said. He opened the door. The wind howled like a banshee, blowing snow into the foyer. The temperature dropped instantly. They dragged their heavy bags over the threshold, struggling against the drifts that had already piled up on the porch. I watched them stumble down the walkway toward their SUV, slipping on the ice, looking small and defeated against the backdrop of the raging storm. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I felt clean, like a wound that had been festering for years had finally been lanced and sterilized. I stepped forward, gripped the heavy oak door, and pushed it shut. Slam. I turned the deadbolt. Click. The sound echoed through the house, final and absolute. The trial was over. The sentence had been executed. The house was quiet again, but for the first time in 20 years, it was a quiet born of peace, not fear. The silence that descended upon the house was heavy, but it wasn't empty. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the air didn't feel charged with tension or pretense. It felt like the air in a sanctuary after the congregation has left, still, sacred, and safe. I walked over to the fireplace and threw 2 large oak logs onto the dying embers. Sparks flew up the chimney, and the flames roared back to life, casting a warm, orange glow across the room. The firelight danced on the brass buttons of Grandpa's uniform and glinted off the purple heart pinned to his chest. He was sitting motionless in the wingback chair, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at the door where his son had just exited. He was looking down at the metal, his thumb tracing the gold profile of George Washington. You did good, Marine, he said softly. His voice was steady, but there was a crack of profound sadness in it. You executed the mission perfectly. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like I had just cut off a limb to save a body. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. I walked over and sat on the thick rug at his feet, resting my head against his knee, just like I used to when I was 7 years old and scared of thunderstorms. Grandpa, I whispered, the tears returning. Not tears of rage this time, but tears of exhaustion. I just kicked my own parents out into a blizzard. I humiliated them. Does that make me a bad daughter? Am I the monster Mom said I was? The guilt was a physical weight. In the Marine Corps, the enemy is a stranger holding a rifle. Tonight, the enemy had been the people whose faces were in my earliest memories. Grandpa's hand, rough and calloused but warm, came down to rest on my hair. He stroked it gently. No, Eliza, you aren't a monster. You're the only one who loved them enough to tell them the truth. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry 50 years of regret. I failed them, Eliza. All these years, I thought I was being a good father by giving them everything. I paid for the cars, the vacations, the bailouts. I thought I was helping. But I wasn't. I was crippling them. I robbed Robert of the chance to be a man because I never let him fall. Tonight, you didn't punish them. You gave them the first real lesson of their lives. He reached into the breast pocket of his tunic and pulled out a small tattered notebook. It was his field diary from Korea, the leather worn smooth by time. He opened it to a marked page. I wrote this the day the armistice was signed, he said, his eyes scanning the faded pencil marks. Victory always has a price. It leaves scars on the land and on the soul. But combat is just the means. Peace is the only goal that matters. We have peace in this house tonight, Eliza. Don't let the cost outweigh the prize. I wiped my eyes and looked up at him. He was right. The house was warm. The threat was gone. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The meatloaf I had prepared as a trap was still sitting on the counter. It had cooled down, but the smell was still incredible. Savory beef, onions, and the sweet tang of caramelized ketchup. I plated 2 large slices, added a scoop of mashed potatoes, and brought the plates into the living room. We didn't move to the dining table. We ate right there by the fire, trays balanced on our knees. It was the best meal I had ever tasted. For the first time in years, I watched Grandpa eat with an appetite. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, his eyes closing in simple pleasure. There was no one rushing him, no one making snide comments about his table manners, no one calculating the cost of the groceries. This tastes like your grandmother's recipe, he said, a small smile touching his lips. Eleanor always added a pinch of brown sugar to the glaze. She did. I smiled back. She taught me that the summer before she passed. We spent the next hour talking, not about the bank accounts, or the betrayal, or the cold room. We talked about Grandma Eleanor. We talked about the Christmas of 1998, when the tree fell over and we all laughed until we cried. We reclaimed the memories of this house, scrubbing away the taint of the last few years with stories of better times. By midnight, Grandpa was asleep in the chair, a soft snore escaping his lips. I covered him with a thick quilt, turned down the lamp, and sat watch until dawn. The next morning broke with a brilliant, blinding sunshine reflecting off the fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving the world white and clean. At 9 a.m., a courier arrived at the door. It was a package from David Monroe's office. I opened it in the kitchen while Grandpa drank his coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way he liked it. It's a draft agreement, I said, scanning the legal jargon. David worked on it all night. He calls it a diversion program. I read the terms out loud. It was brilliant. Instead of pressing immediate felony charges, which would send them to prison for a decade but leave us with nothing but bitterness, David proposed a civil agreement. Robert and Linda would admit to the financial misappropriation. They would agree to a strict repayment plan, every cent of the $200,000 plus interest. But here is the kicker, I said, looking up at Grandpa. They have to get jobs, real jobs. The court will garnish their wages directly, and they have to complete 500 hours of community service at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in North Chicago, scrubbing floors, serving food, changing bedpans. If they miss a single payment or miss a single shift, the agreement is void, and the felony charges are filed instantly. I put the paper down. It was a lifeline, but it was a heavy one. It offered them redemption, but only if they were willing to sweat for it. Grandpa took the paper. He put on his reading glasses and read it over twice. He looked out the window at the snow-covered driveway where his son had walked away the night before. He nodded slowly. Prison is just a cage, Eliza. It doesn't teach you anything except how to wait. This teaches them how to build. He signed the document with a steady hand. Give them a path, he said. But make sure the road is paved with their own sweat, not my tears. I looked at his signature. It was the signature of a commander who had just issued his final orders. The war was over. The reconstruction had begun. 3 months passed. The brutal Chicago winter slowly began to loosen its grip, turning the blackened snow piles into gray slush. But for Robert and Linda Martin, the cold reality of their new life was just setting in. They hadn't moved far geographically, maybe 15 miles north to a gritty neighborhood in Waukegan, but socioeconomically, they were on a different planet. They lived in a garden unit, which is just real estate code for a damp basement apartment with windows at ground level, offering a lovely view of passing ankles and tires. No more crown molding, no more heated floors, just peeling linoleum and the rhythmic thumping of a communal washing machine down the hall. Their days of leisure were dead. The court agreement David Monroe drafted was ironclad. They had to work, and the court garnished 60% of their wages directly to a restitution fund for Grandpa. Robert, the man who used to complain to the waiter if his steak was slightly overcooked, now woke up at 3:30 a.m. every morning. He had landed a job at a massive Amazon fulfillment center. It wasn't a desk job. He was a picker, running through a warehouse the size of 10 football fields, lifting heavy boxes, scanning barcodes, and racing against a productivity algorithm that didn't care about his bad back or his former country club membership. Linda, who hadn't worked a legitimate day since 1995, found herself wearing a blue vest at Walmart. She stood at a register for 8 hours a day, scanning groceries. She learned very quickly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a customer's bad day. I heard through the grapevine that she came home crying every night for the first 2 weeks because her feet swelled up so badly she couldn't fit them into her designer shoes. I didn't visit them, not yet. But old habits die hard. One chilly Tuesday morning, I drove my truck out to the industrial park where the Amazon warehouse was located. I parked across the street, lowered my window, and watched the shift change. At 2:30 p.m., the bay doors opened. A stream of exhausted workers poured out, blinking in the sunlight. Then I saw him. My father walked out, looking 20 years older than he had at Christmas. He was wearing a heavy Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots. He walked with a noticeable limp, his hand rubbing his lower back, a mirror image of how Grandpa used to walk when his arthritis flared up. He stopped at a concrete bench to tie his bootlace. He didn't look arrogant. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He just looked tired, focused, humble. He pulled a brown paper bag out of his pocket, a sandwich he made himself, and took a bite. There was no entitlement in that bite. It was fuel. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at a leech. I was looking at a man earning his existence. 2 days later, the mailman delivered a plain white envelope to the house in Lake Forest. It was addressed to Corporal Harold Martin. I brought it into the kitchen. Grandpa was sitting at the table, drinking his coffee, looking healthier than he had in years. His cheeks had color. He had gained 15 pounds since that night in the ER. "What's this?" he asked, taking the envelope with curious hands. "It's from Waukegan," I said. He opened it slowly with a butter knife. Inside, there was no letter, just a personal check and a small folded piece of notebook paper. Grandpa pulled out the check. It was for $500. It wasn't a court-garnished payment. This was a personal check from Robert's new checking account. He unfolded the note. The handwriting was messy, likely written in a rush on a lunch break. "Dad, this is from my first full paycheck. No garnishment. I wanted you to have it for your heart meds. I know it doesn't fix the past. I'm sorry I was late. I'm sorry for everything. Robert." Grandpa stared at the check. His hand started to tremble, but not from weakness. He ran his thumb over the signature, his son's signature. "In 50 years, Grandpa whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "this is the first time he has ever given me money. He always took, he always asked, but he never gave." He looked up at me, his eyes wet. $500. It's not much compared to what he stole. "But Eliza, I think this is the most valuable piece of paper I own." I nodded. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the sweat equity. That $500 represented 40 hours of aching muscles and swallowed pride. It was blood money, in the best possible sense. By April, the snow was finally gone. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. I found Grandpa in the backyard, wearing his old gardening gloves, kneeling in the mud by the rose bushes Grandma Eleanor had planted decades ago. They looked dead, gnarled, black, and thorny. "I thought the frost killed them," I said, handing him a pair of shears. He shook his head. "No, they aren't dead. They're just dormant." He took the shears and made a sharp, decisive cut, severing a thick, dead branch. "Plants are like people, Eliza," he said, tossing the dead wood onto a pile. "Sometimes you have to cut them back hard. You have to strip away the rot, the dead weight, the parts that are sucking the life out of the roots. It looks violent. It looks painful." He pointed to a tiny green bud emerging from the scarred stump of the bush. "But if you don't do the hard pruning, the new growth can never come." He looked at me, and I knew we weren't talking about roses anymore. "Robert called me yesterday," Grandpa said quietly. "He asked if he could come over for Easter. Not to move back in, just for dinner." I looked at the pile of dead branches, the anger, the theft, the betrayal. Then I looked at the green bud, the check, the apology, the hard work. "What did you say?" I asked. He smiled, looking up at the spring sky. "I told him to bring the dessert. But I told him if he buys it, he better bring the receipt to show he earned it." We both laughed. It was a light, easy sound. The winter was over. The soil was ready. It was time to see what would grow. Easter Sunday arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. The snow piles were gone, replaced by the slushy, hopeful mud of an Illinois spring. At 10 a.m., the phone in the kitchen rang. I stared at the caller ID. It was the landline number for the basement apartment in Waukegan. I picked it up. "Hello? Eliza?" It was my mother. Her voice sounded small, almost fragile. There was none of the sharp, demanding tone she had used for the last 30 years. It's Easter. I know it's last minute, and I know we have no right to ask, but your father and we made a dinner." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I made meatloaf," she whispered. "I used Grandma Eleanor's recipe. The real one. With the brown sugar glaze. I was hoping maybe you and Grandpa could stop by." I looked over at Grandpa Harold. He was sitting in his usual spot, reading the Sunday paper. He had heard every word. He folded the newspaper, placed it on the table, and stood up slowly. He didn't look at me for permission. He looked at me with purpose. "Get the car keys, Sergeant," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. Then he walked to the closet and pulled out his best charcoal suit. It was the one he used to wear to church with Grandma. "Let's go. The peace mission starts now." The drive to Waukegan took 30 minutes. We pulled up to a nondescript brick building with peeling paint. It was a far cry from the gated driveway of Lake Forest. We walked down the concrete steps to the garden unit. The door opened before I could knock. My parents stood there. They were dressed in their best clothes, not the designer resort wear of the past, but simple, clean clothes from a department store rack. Robert wore a button-down shirt that was tight at the shoulders. Linda wore a floral dress. They looked nervous, like teenagers on a first date. Come in," Dad said, ushering us into the cramped living space. The apartment was small, hot, and smelled strongly of onions and roasting meat. But it was spotless. You could eat off the linoleum floor. We sat down at a small folding table covered with a cheap, yellow plastic tablecloth. There was no crystal stemware. There were no silver platters. In the center of the table sat the meatloaf, steaming hot, flanked by a bowl of mashed potatoes and a liter bottle of generic cola. Robert picked up the water pitcher. His hands caught my attention. They used to be manicured, soft hands that only lifted golf clubs. Now, they were rough. The knuckles were swollen, and there were fresh paper cuts and scrapes from handling cardboard boxes at the Amazon warehouse. They were ugly hands. They were beautiful hands. He poured water into Grandpa's glass with a clumsiness that betrayed his anxiety. "Here you go, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry we don't have wine. We're cutting back on everything. This is all we have right now." Grandpa took a sip of the water like it was the finest vintage in the world. "It's perfect, Robert," he said. We began to eat. The meatloaf was delicious. It tasted exactly like the one I remembered from my childhood, before the money, before the greed, before the silence. It tasted like effort. Midway through the meal, the clinking of forks against the plates stopped. My father put down his fork. His shoulders began to shake. He lowered his head into his rough, calloused hands, and a sob escaped him. A raw, guttural sound that seemed to tear through his chest. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the tears dripping through his fingers onto the plastic tablecloth. "I was so wrong, Dad. I was so selfish. I turned into a monster. I looked at you and I saw dollar signs instead of my own father. I don't know how you can even look at me." Linda started crying too, reaching across the table to grip my hand. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Eliza, I am so sorry. For the words, for the bag, for everything." The room was heavy with their shame. Grandpa Harold reached out. He placed his hand, the hand of a soldier, wrinkled and spotted with age, onto his son's shaking shoulder. He patted it gently, a rhythm of comfort I had known my whole life. "I know, son," Grandpa said softly. His voice was the anchor in the storm. "I know. You got lost. You got lost in the things that don't matter." He waited until Robert looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "The road home is always long, Robert, and it's always uphill. But you walked it. You didn't run away. You walked it back to me. That's all that matters. You're here now." We finished the meal in a different kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers or the hostile silence of enemies. It was the silence of healing. It was the feeling of a bone setting back into place after being dislocated for years. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of purple and gold, I drove Grandpa back to Lake Forest. He fell asleep in the passenger seat almost immediately, his head resting against the window, a look of absolute peace on his face. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was drifting. I thought about the battles I had fought overseas. I thought about the medals tucked away in my drawer. None of them felt as heavy or as significant as what had happened in that basement apartment today. I realized then that the greatest war I would ever fight wasn't against insurgents or terrorists. It was the war for the soul of my family. It was the battle to drag the truth out into the light, to burn away the rot, and to force the people I loved to become the people they were meant to be. Love isn't just hugs and Christmas presents. As the Bible says, love is patient, love is kind. But sometimes love has to be fierce. Love has to be a shield and a sword. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails, but sometimes it has to fight to win. I looked over at Grandpa sleeping soundly, safe and respected. I thought of my father's rough hands pouring water. I smiled to myself as I turned into the driveway of our home. Mission accomplished. Looking back, I realized the hardest battle wasn't kicking my parents out into the snow. It was accepting that peace isn't always the goal. For years, Grandpa confused love with silence. He thought that by shielding his son from consequences, he was being a good father. But as we learned, shielding someone from reality doesn't help them. It cripples them. True love requires accountability. Just like those rose bushes in the garden, sometimes you have to make the hard, painful cuts to strip away the rot. Only then can new, healthy life begin to grow. Never be afraid to set boundaries. It is the highest form of love you can give. Now, I want to turn this over to you. Have you ever had to practice tough love with a family member to save your relationship? Was it worth the pain? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find their own strength. If Eliza and Grandpa Harold's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more powerful stories like this to light. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to plant a new garden.